So the learning objectives for this event for receiving credit are: after the session, participants will obtain some insight into the exceptional work and contributions of 3 women fellows to architecture and society. I apologize, I live near a train, so if you all hear a train in the background, that's what that noise is. And then after this session, participants will be able to define the 5 different categories of nominations that define an AIA fellow through a broad array of experience levels. Participants will be encouraged to identify and determine the professional path that aligns with the College of Fellows' objectives. After this session, participants will learn the importance of having a mentor through their professional career and fellowship path. After this session, participants will learn strategies to create positive opportunities and alliances that will help overcoming with some of the challenges and expectations for women in design professions. And so this is just a brief overview of the diversity in our region, and that being Louisiana. Of the total of 1,229 licensed architects in Louisiana, 82% are male and 18% are female. Of that total, 93% of the licensed architects are white and 7% are non-white. There's been increasing fellowship in the Gulf State. There has been a total of 236 fellows in the Gulf State region, roughly 1 to 5 fellows per year. And the current total of fellows in the Gulf State is 103. The College of Fellows. AIA fellows are recognized with the AIA's highest membership honor for their exceptional work and contribution to architecture and society. Architects who have made significant contribution to the profession and society and who have exemplified architectural excellence can become a member of the AIA College of Fellows. Only 3% of the AIA members have this distinction, and only 18% of fellows are women. And now we'll go over the objectives for obtaining a fellowship or objects of nomination. Object 1 is design, urban design, or preservation. Object 2 is education, research, literature, or practice. Object 3 is led the institute or a related organization. Object 4 is public service, government, industry, or organization. Object 5 is alternative career, volunteer work with an organization not directly connected with the built environment or service to society. Now I'd like to introduce our 3 panelists for this evening's event. Beginning from chronological order in succession to the fellowship, we'll start with Judith Kinnard, FAIA College of Fellows Class 2004, Object 2. Judith Kinnard is nationally recognized for her impact as a leader in the architectural education. Through her career, she has maintained an active commitment to the practice and developed an approach characterized by sensitive and innovative solutions to issues of site and program. Her work has included numerous small-scale build commissions and more than a dozen national competitions dealing with larger-scale issues of urban design, cultural institutions, and housing. Second, we have Angela O'Brien, FAIA College of Fellows Class 2013, Object 5. Under Angela O'Brien's visionary leadership, Perez has grown into a national firm with locations across the country and projects around the globe. During her time as president of Perez, Angela has opened 9 new offices throughout the U.S., won federal contracts in Germany, Afghanistan, Iraq, and West Africa, and added construction, procurement, and real estate development to the firm's service offerings. She has over 30 years of experience in design and management of diverse project types, including multi-unit housing, hospitality, recreation, master planning, historic renovation, education, government buildings, LEED certified projects, military construction, and more. Finally, we have Allison Anderson, FAIA College of Fellow Class 2014, Object 2. Allison Anderson is recognized for her civic projects, which are carefully crafted and inherently defensible against climate challenges. After Hurricane Katrina devastated her community, Allison's Design for Recovery focused their attention on sustainability, adaptation, and resilience. Allison serves on the American Institute of Architects Resilience and Adaptation Advisory Group, the Sustainability Leadership Group, and the Climate Action Task Force. I am excited to present our first panelist, Judith Kinnard, FAIA College of Fellows 2004, object to.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to talk about this topic and get you all thinking about when and how you would want to position yourself for this this opportunity within our profession, which has certainly been a very positive thing for me. When I went up in 2004, that was obviously 16 years ago. It was probably a little bit early in my career to do so. When I think about what I've done since, it sort of feels like it may have been a bit of a reach. But the reason I titled this slide 35 words is that one of the first things you do when you've been encouraged to go up and sit down with a sponsor or with a team of folks that are advising you, or simply with yourself, is craft this statement that is intended to kind of summarize your case in a mere 35 words. And that's what, when they review these, that's probably the first thing they read. And when you're awarded fellowship in a hall, hopefully again someday, with robes and medals and things like that, those are the 35 words that they read. And so at that point in my time, I had been an educator for much of my career and had a small practice. And so I wasn't going to go up in design. I knew that it had to be education. I had just finished 5 years as chair at UVA, and it had been a sort of kind of pivotal 5 years in the life of the institution. And I felt that that was what I was going to highlight in my submission. Could I have the next slide? Now, you probably can't read this slide, but it's sort of based on a map. But the bulk of my, when I went up for fellowship, I was in Virginia. So someone told me once that I was the first woman fellow in any of the Gulf states, but I did not achieve fellowship in any of the Gulf states. That may or may not be true, but I studied in Ithaca, New York, worked in Boston, taught at Syracuse, taught at Princeton, then spent about 20 some odd years in Charlottesville, and then in 2008 came down to New Orleans. So towards the end of my years in Charlottesville, I became a fellow. And then, so various leadership roles, because I think it, of course you can chart your career in retrospect, but ideally, perhaps way more than I did, it would be nice to chart one's career in prospect, and where you're thinking about how you might want to layer different opportunities on it. So I was chair for those 5 years, and then following fellowship, I was, and I think perhaps enhanced by that, or the opportunities became perhaps, I was afraid this would happen. My iPad. I know how to silence my phone, but I don't know how to silence my iPad. I think that perhaps the confidence and the honor of fellowship made it easier to take on these other roles. I became president of the Association of Schools of Architecture and later president of the accrediting board. So those were opportunities that followed the fellowship, but I think were in some ways related to it. Can I have the next slide? So at the time, I do not have my package for fellowship anymore. I remember I was on sabbatical. One of the things you realize is that you have to invest a massive amount of time in this effort. And I know we're going to talk about mentorship later, but I would not have done this unless I had been pushed to do it. I mean, pushed, basically threatened by my husband, in fact, who was already a fellow of AIA, had been for a few years, that if I didn't do that, he would never speak to me again. So I spent some time learning in design, and I didn't have a graphics department. So the graphics are important, and hopefully many people will have those resources. I didn't hire a designer, but I learned in design. And so these are some of the pages that were sort of related. This was tied to teaching. I started a program in Barcelona with landscape architecture. And one of the hallmarks of my 5 years at UVA was enhancing the linkages between landscape and architecture, and indeed starting a dual master's degree facilitated kind of opportunity that a number of really great people have taken advantage of and now have professional degrees in both disciplines. Next slide. And of course, I always have taught conventional studios, and the work of my students has been really a key part of who I am. Next slide. And one of the things I did was, at the time I was appointed chair, Bill McDonough was dean at UVA for 5 years. And it was a sort of tumultuous 5 years in the sense that Bill was a fairly non-traditional dean, and it was almost like someone coming in from a different universe at that moment in time. And we were all interested in sustainability, had no idea what it was, and didn't know how to advance it in the school. And neither did he. I mean, he knew all about sustainability, but he had zero interest in advancing it within the school because it was all about Bill. But in any event, as chair, I realized that this was something that our students really were interested in. And I recruited a young faculty member, John Quale, to come teach in the program, and asked him if he would like to lead the first solar decathlon. It was 2002, it was the first solar decathlon. And so he leapt at the opportunity. We made allegiances with engineering. And then this is the results of those efforts. And they won the architecture part of it. The prize is very complicated. And boy, the process is complicated. And I would never recommend that anyone, any school or any individual really take this on unless they've really changed it. But I mean, it was an amazingly rewarding experience, but boy, what a lot of work. Next slide. So sustainability and design build became something that was really relatively new to that program, and I was very much pushing it forward. I already mentioned, I think, the relationship to landscape, but Beth Meyer and I started a Barcelona program that we brought for students together in landscape and architecture to Barcelona for 10 days, graduate students for about 5 years. And that was a pretty special enrichment of the program. Next slide. And then I had, of course, my practice had been mostly residential at that point. I mean, when you live in Charlottesville, Virginia, that's pretty much, and you're mostly an educator, those are the kinds of opportunities that come forward. But I also entered a lot of competitions associated with housing and was reasonably successful. A couple of them were in New Orleans. I think I was a finalist or an honorable mention in both of these New Orleans ones, which I entered long before I knew I would be moving to New Orleans. I think at that point I had been to New Orleans with a group of students once. Next slide. And then I did some housing work in this one. This one we got an AIA, unbuilt, but an AIA Virginia award for mixed use infill housing. We had a client for this and came pretty close, but the numbers never worked. Next slide. And then another competition, this one in New York for housing, and I think I got a second prize in that one. The good thing about getting second prizes is that they don't build it, but that's probably just as well, because occasionally when you win and they do build something that that has its own challenges. Of course, we do like to build though. Next slide. And at a certain moment, I was given the opportunity to renovate the cafe, and Regina may remember this at UVA. So I was there about 6 months ago. Well, maybe it was a little longer ago. Maybe it was last winter before COVID. And the cafe doesn't look that much different, but that was when a variety of architects were making contributions to the building. But faculty architects. And I know that that has been something that our current dean is working with Regina and her firm on in its own way. Hopefully that will get revived pretty soon. Next slide. So following leaving Virginia, it was actually rather hard for me because that had been my the bulk of my professional career had been pursued there. And coming to New Orleans was exciting, but I wasn't coming for, I was coming because my husband was going to be dean. And I was offered a full professorship, an academic appointment, and the provost and the president and the faculty seemed very appreciative of my coming. But I knew that effectively any leadership role within the school was gone. That wasn't going to happen. And although I toyed with the idea of pursuing deanships elsewhere, that didn't seem very logical either. So I decided to look at leadership opportunities in national leadership opportunities in our professional organizations. So I was asked to run for president of ACSA and was elected president and had 3 years on that board. And then a few years after that, I was asked to be part of the NAB board and was elected president of that. And so that was those two opportunities together probably took about 8 years, in addition to teaching of my of the decades or the 15 or 16 years since I became a fellow. And all of these were really great opportunities that in some ways built upon my initial fellowship. Now the next slide is going to be a little bit weird, but it's intended to be amusing. Cassidy, could I have the next slide? These boys seem to like their hardware. The first and the only time I wear these is when graduation, I've been known to wear them, but then I make too much noise when I walk down with my robes. This, of course, is the fellowship medal from AIA, and that was the first one. But then each of these other leadership roles, and then when I became, I was nominated to be distinguished professor at ACSA, and that was another event. But the sort of accumulation of the pins and the medals and the hardware, it is kind of funny. And of course, we don't have lapels, but I have another drawer full of lapel pins that I could wear. Maybe I should just wear them all the time and amuse my students. But so in any event, what you have to look forward to if you, once you achieve fellowship is at least one of these things hanging around your neck, and then hopefully many more. And then my last slide is, since I came to New Orleans, I've participated, and this is something I really value, supporting others in their journey to fellowship, but also in their journey to promotion as in the academic community, promotion as a tenured faculty member, as a full professor, et cetera. So I do spend a lot of time supporting others, and I was privileged to be asked by Wayne Troyer to sponsor him for fellowship, which he was able to achieve prior to his passing. Very emotional effort for all of us involved. And then of course, Lee Ledbetter and Tracy Lee. And then I've been writing fellowship letters of support to many others. And because I was involved in all those organizations, the two NCARB presidents that I got to know well, Christine and Terry, who had not yet achieved fellowship, asked me if I would write for them, and I was delighted to do so, as well as many others, former students in some cases, treasured colleagues and others. So that's it. Looking forward to hearing from my colleagues and then the discussion.
Okay, can you all hear me? Regina and Cassidy, okay. Thank you, Regina and Cassidy, for inviting me to join this panel. It's great to see Allison and Judith. Hi, ladies. I thought, since I think one of the goals of this is to encourage perhaps more women to apply, that I would quickly go through my submittal and then give you guys some tips and some kind of amusing stories about what happened along the way. So I did hire a consultant to help me because I did not want to do this more than once. And I had heard from friends of mine, men who had applied, that some of them had applied, you know, many years, like 3, 4, 5 times. And I thought, God, I am only doing this once. And like Judith, I was really kind of pushed into it. I a half dozen guy friends who kept telling me I needed to apply, especially after all the work I'd done in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina with the AIA. And they were insisting that I apply under the objective that is service to the profession and to the Institute. However, I had served as president of AIA New Orleans and been on the board of AIA Louisiana for a total of 6 years, and then served as president of the New Orleans chapter. But I had not been on the national board, and I understood that that was usually kind of a prerequisite, really, for fellowship. So the consultant I hired, Joan Capelin from New York, she's helped a number of architects in New Orleans and the Gulf States to apply, and she's very knowledgeable about the process. And then on top of that, I did have one person in my office, God bless Judith. I don't know how you did it without all the help that I got. It sounds awful. This woman in my office, administrative assistant with a degree in museum curating, who had tremendous graphic skills, spent half of her time for 6 months. So that's easily 500 to 600 man hours. So it is a daunting process. And we followed Joan Caplin's advice to the letter. This was the consultant from New York. Let's start going through it. So this is my cover letter. Dean Ken Schwartz was my sponsor. Kind of a fun story about that. This is what the pages look like. I mean, you can orient it the other way to portrait or landscape. We chose to go landscape. But the graphics are very important according to Joan's advice. It's very critical that you show how your work has had some kind of ripple effect or at a national level. And not for nothing, but and it's not my style to brag, actually. So I'm kind of embarrassed by some of the language in here. But they told me, everybody who advised me said, you have to literally sound like you created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. Just kidding. But you've got to spin the stuff to be worthy. So let's keep going. Why don't you go ahead, Regina, and just keep paging through. So this is the summary page. Sorry, I'm going to put my glasses on. That starts to tell the story. So next page. One of the things that the consultant also told me was that that at the end of the day, we're all architects, and this is an architecture award. So even though my objective was service to society, and we needed to tell the story of all the nonprofit boards that I sit on and other work that I've done besides architecture, which included being on the board of a of a mental health clinic and an economic development nonprofit and a whole host of other nonprofits, including a charter school startup, that we are architects in the end. And so I needed to show my work. All right, so let's keep going. Regina, yeah. So here we have, background. Let's get to the work. You could keep going. So this is about service to the community, a lot of text, as you can see, boards and task forces that I've been on, pro bono projects, a lot of community work and community outreach. At the end of the day, after this consultant reviewed the work of my firm, she said that you can keep scrolling. It's just, you can see a lot of stuff in here. CityWorks, I was a co-founder of CityWorks, which was a nonprofit designed to advise the city and do, champion the cause of better urban planning and urban design. This has now rolled into the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, of whose board I'm on right now, and we're in the middle of transitioning it. And it's affiliated with Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, Housing NOLA, and Housing Louisiana. This is an article that was written about me in the aftermath of Katrina and what happened. Nice long article if anyone wants to read it. A lot about what was happening in the city and my role in it. This is the Claiborne Corridor Cultural Collaborative. So if you could stop here for a second, Regina. One of the things that the consultant, after looking at so my company does a lot of work. I think a lot of you may have heard of Perez. And out of the hundreds of projects she looked at that we had done in recent years, many of them could be classified as bread and butter work, right? They're, for lack of a better word, repair projects and maintenance projects. I mean, re-roofing, really stuff that's not very photogenic. So she said, she really thought that our urban planning and urban design work was the most interesting work. And so out of all that work, maybe 10% of the projects were new construction that was noteworthy, or these urban planning projects. And she particularly liked this, the Claiborne Corridor Cultural Collaborative Mapping Project, which isn't really any architecture, but it was about mapping culture bearers and along the Claiborne Corridor and how they influence the urban life, the city life that's happening along that corridor. So that was a very, very interesting project that we did for the city of New Orleans. Next, Regina. Next slide. And this is more kind of images that came out of those reports that we did. This is GUS 2 and GUS 3 housing, have to do with the affordable housing work that we do. And much of our work could be classified as social impact work, and this would be fall in that category. Next, Regina. Is that it? Is that the end? Oh, there we go. So this is the GUS housing. Yeah, quite traditional. Next. Continue. We have here the mission. Okay, that's actually a project we did with New Orleans Tulane University students. That was going to be a renovation, and then it fell down during Hurricane Katrina, and we raised money and built it new. And it was a very green building that had geothermal and a lot of other green and sustainable features. This project, 1231 Decatur, won an AIA award, and it was a historic renovation in the French Quarter. Next. Yeah, that's all 1231 Decatur. Next. Master plan. Oh, this is a project that never happened, but it did win an award from AIA New Orleans, and it's a park that would have been built by the Army Corps of Engineers along the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal in the upper and lower Ninth Wards. And frankly, I think there's more of a need now for it than ever, but maybe it'll still happen one day. This is part of that project. Same project. Next. And then Port Allen Riverfront Master Plan. This was another really fun project that we did, urban planning for the entire downtown. Lynn Robertson was mayor at the time, and then she later became executive director of AIA Louisiana. But so this, because she lost the next mayoral election, this plan did not get implemented, sadly. But still, it was a wonderful project. Continue, Regina. Next slide. There we go. These are renderings for that same master plan. And it involved really enlivening the waterfront in downtown Port Allen. And then this is Patrick Taylor Science and Technology Regional Academy, which also won an AIA New Orleans award. A very green project, very sustainable. It's all about hands-on learning and interactive learning. Very interesting building. Next slide, Regina. This shows more of that project. So it was all oriented to, of course, capture the sunlight, and we had sundials, and the building, sections of the building were left open so that the students could see how for example, what the wall section was like and how it all worked. And again, a very green and sustainable project. I believe we achieved LEED Gold on this one. And then the letters of reference. So you have to get, as all of you know, 7 fellows to write letters in support, and then 2 people can be not fellows, but a total of 9, I think it is. Yeah. And so with the interesting story about this, continue, Regina. Let's see, is that the end? Is there another page, or is that it? Yeah, that's it. That's the end. Kind of a fun story about what happened with my sponsor. So I'm not going to say who it was, but there was someone who was insisting on being my sponsor for the entire year before I submitted this thing. And because he had worked with me on some projects and insisted that he got what my work was about and got me. And so I agreed. He was very gracious, and he helped me all through this process and was critiquing the work. And then at the 11th hour, 1 month before we were going to submit, he was very embarrassed, and he called and told me that he had accidentally, or his firm had accidentally allowed both his architecture license and his membership in the AIA to lapse for like 10 years. So he could not sign my letter and submit as my sponsor. So I was ready to kill him. I was like, what are you talking about? We just spent a quadrillion man hours and dollars on this thing. So thankfully, Dean Ken Schwartz, who had offered to sponsor me a year before. I called him up a month before, and he said, wow, okay. We have a lot of work to do to get up to speed fast. So we said, well, we've done all the work really, but we obviously need to make sure you're comfortable with it and that you agree with the direction we're going in. So he jumped in full force at the end there and saved this thing for me. So I'm very, very grateful. I don't even think Judith knew that story. And yeah, it was like in the last month. So that's how it happened. And here we are. Now I'm a fellow. So that's it for me. Happy to turn it over to Allison now.
Great.
Yeah, now we'll start with Allison or continue with Allison.
Well, it's great to be with you. I thank you very much, Cassidy, for doing the hard work of repeating my 35-word summary at the very beginning. It is the focus of a lot of the time of your preparation. So the focus of our practice is resilience. So this was very much the focus of my FAIA portfolio, and it seemed appropriate. In 2014, we had been several years of recovery after Hurricane Katrina. And so we had a lot of work to show for that, for the rebuilding and recovery of our hometown, which is Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. And so we had a lot to show. Go ahead, next one. So this obviously is Frank Lloyd Wright. It was not my class in undergraduate school at USC, but it almost could have been. When I got there in 1980, things had improved a little bit. Next slide. And I became a fellow primarily because I was, again, encouraged by someone who I really respected, like Judith and like Angela, and that was Alan Eskew. And many of you know him, have worked for him. Certainly the incredible leader of architecture in New Orleans for many years. He sponsored me. He worked with me for a year. We treated it like it was a design project, and it very much was. I did it myself. And I'm glad to say that when I was inducted in 2014, and I'm right there in the front row, being an A person, I'm glad that there are more women in this picture, although maybe not as many as there should be. I will tell you, starting out, I never had a female architecture professor, not in undergrad or grad school. I never had a female boss in an architecture office. I never had a female mentor. So those are things that I try to do, like the other people on this panel. Those are things I try to do for other people. They're all very important to improve this process. So next slide. So my very first job in an architecture office was for this architect, Vladimir Osipov. He was a vernacular modernist in Hawaii, which is where I grew up. He was a Russian emigre who synthesized the sort of environmental and cultural features into this sort of tropical modern lexicon. Next slide. My last job for working for someone else was in Las Vegas. It was designing casinos and hotels. I think only one piece of what I designed actually still exists, and it is this crazy diorama that's part of Caesar's Palace on the Las Vegas Strip. Next slide. So I went back to grad school at the University of Texas in Austin in 1989, and clearly there was some carryover here. We were in the Charles Moore studio. There was a lot of sort of explosion of color and life and street life. But one of the things I think we learned more than just style was really about how to collaborate. He was the master collaborator. He started many architectural offices. He was a fantastic professor. He had a visual memory like no one I've ever met before. But that's, I think, the takeaway from architecture school at UT. Next slide. So that lesson of collaboration is one that I've tried to share throughout my teaching career. I've taught for over 9 years, plus a few semesters here and there, teaching at the University of Texas, at LSU, and at Tulane. Collaboration's really the bedrock of our profession. It's collaboration with the design team, it's collaboration with the client and the contractor and the community that inherits that project. But an academic career had other benefits when I was a young woman. Next slide. So I have 3 children, and that career kind of made it possible to have a flexible schedule, to take vacations with the kids, to have that healthcare and that maternity leave that were so important. These are things that are really much more difficult for women in the profession than they are for men. It's proven to deter women from licensure, from advancement in the profession. And so these are, issues we really need to resolve if we want to have more women becoming fellows or even just licensed architects. Next slide. So for much of the time my kids were growing up, we lived in Mississippi. And in 2005, we had just built this house on the left, this very sustainable demonstration house, first grass roof in Mississippi. 5 weeks later, Katrina hit, but it was still standing. That was the amazing thing. It got a lot of national press because people could see it. They could see that the architect's house was standing. Why was that? Why was this crazy looking house in the middle of a very traditional neighborhood still standing? So it brought us a lot of attention. Next slide. So one of the great opportunities of my career happened immediately after Katrina. We were tapped to join the Mississippi Renewal Forum and the Louisiana Recovery Authority as part of the architecture team by Andres Duany and Duany Plater-Zyberg. And we were the token modernists, literally. When the national media would come up and say, oh, you new urbanists, you just do one style, he would drag them over to my table and say, well, look at this. It's not about style, it's really about rebuilding community. And so the national news media focused a lot on our work because it was so unexpected, even in popular magazines and newspapers. Next slide. So there were a few projects that directly resulted from participating in those charrettes, including this project for retail in a floodplain and finding ways to sort of manage that 5 to 6 foot high difference, floor elevation difference from the sidewalk to the first floor. This is now this is now occupied by the Studio Waveland, which used to be the glassblowers, Mitchell and Larkin Gaudet. So this building was really kind of a tribute to Sam Mockbee, who was one of the great Mississippi architects, this kind of double roofed dog trot vernacular. But again, it was updated to fit into this brand new context. Next slide. So I practiced with my husband. We went to undergraduate school together. We went to graduate school together. And he used to work at SQ Dumez Ripple for 13 years. He commuted. And after Katrina, we had a lot of work. And I had the great opportunity to find a great architect right in my living room. So Alan was incredibly generous and came over on a Saturday and sat down with us and went through everything business that we needed to know for how to start and run our own business. And that kind of generosity is really unique, I think, in this profession. So, practicing and studying together gives us kind of a shorthand for design choices. We share the work 50-50. However, because I founded the practice and because there is some advantage to remaining a woman-owned small business, I did retain 51% of the ownership, and that does help with some federal projects. Next slide. So after Katrina, we started really doing some unusual work, and we started looking into the alignment between building for natural disasters and building for civil disasters, warfare, blast, other kinds of unrest. And so that extreme weather versus the kind of other assaults really ended up taking a lot of the same sort of solutions. Next slide. So one of our first projects after Katrina was to build community shelters, community evacuation shelters out in the country with continuity of operations that withstand almost any threat. We eventually designed 9 structures, different armored structures. This one sort of invites the wind to go around and over the building rather than interrupt it. Next slide. We were also charged with restoring a lot of the buildings that sort of survived the storm, like this old school building, which became a civic center and is now a museum with a outpost of the Smithsonian this year. So that's kind of exciting. Next slide. But we also were looking at a broader scale kind of design project, the kind that dealt with urban landscapes to create stormwater solutions for, to sort of manage increased flooding, to create this city scale canopy for shade to reduce the urban heat island effect and to create these places for people, these third places for people to get outside and enjoy. So places like the Duck Pond in Bay St. Louis. Next slide. So this kind of, all of this work, the armored work, the resilience work, the stormwater work, the urban landscapes, all of that kind of came together in Rebuild by Design. We led post-Sandy a competition. We were selected one of 10 teams, our scrappy little team from the Gulf Coast. We were assigned to work in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where economic disinvestment and environmental contamination kind of were quite familiar to us. So we came up with a system of dealing with these edges and helping them remain spongy and absorptive so that those would intercept some of the water that might be coming up through the Long Island Sound. Next slide. The other thing we did was design ways to fill gaps in these most underserved communities, neighborhoods that were just sort of cut off by lots of multimodal transport systems and cut off by natural features as well. So these were places that could become shelters, they could become job training centers, they could serve as housing for the most vulnerable, they could fill in gaps like daycare and fresh food, but they would also, so that was their everyday sort of function. But in an emergency, they could fill they were staging points for distribution, and they were places that could shelter residents in exceptional circumstances. Next slide. And in this project, collaboration, again, was the theme. We held a 4-day charrette. We got everyone at the table. We got state officials and local nonprofits and engineers and ecologists and just everybody, so that these solutions for resilience were really robust. And also so that we would have that community support for resilience that would outlive our tenure in Bridgeport, because we knew we were going home and we knew someone else would have to carry the ball forward for many, many years. Next slide. We are a research-led practice. We really focus on 6 areas. And really all of those can be combined into one word, which is adaptation. Climate change is unrelenting. We have to adapt or face increasing consequences. Next slide. So being a research-led practice means that we share these lessons learned. We sometimes do it through presentations like this, but we also do it through writing in places like the Oxford Research Encyclopedia, where I wrote the Adaptation to Climate Hazards Through Architecture. Next slide. So becoming a fellow really inspired me to contribute at a national level, very similar to what Angela and Judith were talking about. So I was asked to join the Resilience Education Working Group 3 years ago. It has now become the Resilience and Adaptation Advisory Group, but at the time we were writing the 9-course Resilience and Adaptation series. And if you haven't looked at it, I encourage anyone from Louisiana to look at it and take some of those courses. The AIA right now is taking on climate action very seriously. I hope that you will become involved if you're not already involved. It's really important that we get our army of 95,000 members, as Carl Elefonte says, to get behind this and to really take on how we're going to mitigate carbon, how we're going to decarbonize the built landscape, and how we're going to adapt to these increasing climate challenges. So thank you. I think we're going to talk next sort of more generally about becoming a fellow. And what that entails. Cassidy, do you?
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right.
I need to know. But yeah, so next, I'll go to the next slide. So if, Allison, if you want to, or if you all want to talk about
Sure. I'll kick it off. So it's really important to understand this is an individual award. It's not a firm award. It is your, it is all about you. As Angela talked about, it's hard sometimes to sort of toot your own horn, but it's really important that you see it as your work and your award. So really, there's some, standards like must have 10 cumulative years with AIA, but really what they're interested in is what is the effect of your work on both the public, on your peers in the profession, and on the wider sort of profession itself. So that is what they call the ripple effect. Do you want to go to the next one? And so what that ripple effect really is has the nominee been nationally recognized? Have they influenced others? Have they won awards? Have they served on juries or, whatever? Have they been published? And have they been active in the AIA? Because even though, for example, Judith and I went in as under Object 2, it absolutely was about service to the profession as well. Everything you do really sort of reflects back on the profession. Next. And so that's what they're looking for, that kind of widespread recognition of the results and what kind of, there's lots of different ways that you can proceed. Those could be like you're an award winner, or it could be just a lot of publications or requests to speak. But they're looking for that evidence. And so, for example, last year, I was asked to sponsor a very close friend of mine with excellent design work. And she's going in under Object 1, which is design. And we ended up pulling back at the last minute because we didn't feel like there was enough evidence of published work, of awards, and those kinds of things. And that's because she's too busy doing great work to actually participate and get that public relations machine behind her and get those awards and take the time away from her actual work to pursue awards. And so we ended up going back in this year, and I'm very hopeful that she will become a fellow next year. Angela and Judith, do you want to jump in at any point?
Yeah, I'll jump in here and just echo a little bit, Allison, what you're saying. Taking the time to do this. I mean, we're all so busy doing our work, right? How do you carve out time? And I think somebody just asked a question, I think it was Jessica Walker, about, how do you pick the track you're going to go under out of the 5 objectives? So I think if you're young and you're still relatively early in your career, you might think about what direction you want your career to go. I mean, I know it's sometimes hard to track that. My own career took many zigs and zags, and I did all kinds of strange things, but which I didn't get into. Like Allison, I had 3 children too early on. My kids are grown now, but can certainly relate to all those challenges. I think you need to, if I had it to do over again, to think about like 10 years before applying for fellowship, what is the objective I want to go under, and then start pursuing that actively. Like to your point, Allison, start applying, submitting my work for national AI awards, which actually my firm never does. We only submit to AI New Orleans and occasionally AI Louisiana. We've never submitted to Gulf States or national because it's a lot of work. and we're too busy getting the work out. So I think you need to be thinking in that direction. And if it's going to be in education, you know, do some of the things that Judith mentioned. Look for opportunities to lead at the national level. I've been on some national boards of directors, not the AIA though, which is why I ended up going to Objective 5, because a lot of my work had been outside of AIA and outside of architecture. I had been on the National Board of Commercial Real Estate Women, which was really fun and involved mentoring women in 10 Western states and doing a whole bunch of stuff I never thought I would do. And one of my projects took me to Afghanistan. We designed a dormitory for women, 200 beds, at the American University in Kabul in Afghanistan. And that contract required that I mentor young women who were there. So that's kind of been a theme throughout my career. And part of that went into this application. You know, we talked about service to society. So mine was, this consultant that helped me felt like my experience with, and even ongoing work was just too broad to fit into the other 4 objectives. So I think it's hard because, you know, I don't know, Allison and Judith, if you all agree, probably your work could have fit under maybe 2 or 3 different objectives, but you have to pick the one that is going to perhaps allow you to showcase the greater part of what you've been doing for the last 10 or 20 years. Does that make sense?
Yeah, my understanding is that design is the most difficult unless you have national awards. Although someone I wrote for last year, Janet Bloomberg, a very talented designer in DC, she had a lot of local awards, and I was kind of nervous of whether she would make it in that category, but she did.
Oh,
and
she
I was delighted. She had a real strength in the number of awards and the quality of the work, and it was a beautiful package. But I remember having this conversation with Lee Ledbetter, who Lee, of course, went up under design, and so did Wayne, I believe. Well, I know Wayne did. But that said, even if you feel that you have a strong design portfolio and have numerous awards, that still contributes. If you choose to go up in another category, the depth and quality of your design work, you could see that from certainly from Allison's submission and from Angela's, that has impact, because for better or for worse, we are visual people. And that when that jury starts looking at the portfolios, they're certainly analyzing and reading, et cetera, but they're also looking. And certainly that they're wanting to make sure that there's a sort of value of excellence in visual communication and visual and quality. And that's why, of course, having a graphic designer for this really would help. If you have someone in your studio, that would be really great.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that I sponsored actually Ace Torrey, and he was successful. He went in under design, but his was kind of interesting. He didn't have a lot of national awards, but he has a very niche market that he serves. He works on zoos all over the world, all over the United States and all over the world, really. So it was a pretty unusual submittal. I convinced him to hire the same consultant that helped me. He argued with her a lot and didn't want to do what she told him to do. So I think in the end, he ended up firing her and finishing it on his own, but he was successful, and it blew me away to see the quality and variety of his work and just how deep he was into that niche. My gosh, it was so interesting to learn more about his. But he went in under design, and I would say in a very unconventional, even though he's had a very unconventional design path, so to speak.
One of the great things that they're doing now to underscore what I think you both have offered, which is they now, of course, put successful packages in various categories on the web. And it's extremely helpful. They didn't do that when I went up, but I certainly have been looking at them a lot in terms of the sponsorship activities that I've been doing. And so if you're in your late 30s or mid 30s and you're thinking, okay, when would I want to do this? Maybe when I'm in my mid 40s or something. Take a look at those now. The other thing I'd add is that sometimes if you go up under the wrong category, sometimes you do not aren't successful just for that reason. Because I don't think they switch your categories. You know, I think you've made the decision. So you can't, they're not going to say, oh, not really design, why don't we put them in education? I don't think they do that now.
Right, and I
will say that,
I think some categories get a lot more submittals than others. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think there's a quota. I mean, I think they're fine with having more awards in one category than another. I think it's kind of inevitable.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is some of the objectives are going to be maybe more competitive than others.
Yeah.
If
Each of the jurors has to read 300 submissions a year. There's 7 jurors. So literally the first round, they just go through and they spend about 2 or 3 minutes per submittal. So if you think the graphics are important, that is really why the graphics are important. And if you get tossed on the slush pile on the first round, you don't make it back on the second one.
Yeah.
It's got to be eye-catching. It's got to grab them.
Well, it's got to have the content there, but it's got to also be very readable.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think, just to maybe shift to another topic that people haven't asked, but it's a key one, is when you are selecting the people or, you know, recruiting people to write for you, you really need to effectively chart that. In other words, each one is a piece of the larger argument. And you typically, and this has certainly happened in my case, when I write for people, once or twice, I've gotten pretty in-depth outlines about what they wanted me to say, which was incredibly helpful. And but in other instances, no. But it would be very effective for you to be able to write bullet points to anyone you asked about what you wanted them to, what you were hoping they would highlight in their letter.
I think that's really important. And the other thing is getting that geographical spread of people writing a letter of recommendation for you. If you work and live in New Orleans and all you have are people who live and work in New Orleans writing for you, you aren't demonstrating that kind of ripple effect. And they are absolutely looking for that. So it's not always getting the best known architect, it's getting the person who knows you best and can really, you know, sort of represent that viewpoint.
Yeah, and to Judith's point, each one of your letter writers, they shouldn't all be saying the same thing, right? So you do need to help them along because they should be, each may be highlighting how they know you and why they know you, but in a different way, or highlighting all the different aspects of you and your work so that they're not repetitive.
Right, absolutely.
Not sounding the same.
And then you have to herd these people along. Oh my God, the job of a sponsor, you starting about a month before the deadline, you have to start pinging these people because you're living in panic that they won't follow up.
Yeah, and I've written letters for a couple of people too. I forgot to mention that I didn't sponsor necessarily, but yeah. You have to know them and you have to know their work, but also make sure you're not just repeating what everyone else is saying. So they have to help you with that.
We have a question from Hannah. This is a question for all 3 panelists. How do you feel becoming an FAIA has changed your career? Any new opportunities you didn't have before?
Oh, it's a great question. Thank you, Hannah. So I sometimes struggle with this confessionality, but I will say that as a woman in this field, I'm continually proving myself. And this fellowship really helps other people recognize that you've achieved something, right? That you've achieved something beyond the standard. And so I think, honestly, clients treat you a little bit differently. Weird as that sounds, that has some meaning for people. They might not know exactly what it means, but they're like, oh, fellow, okay, nice. I think it doesn't necessarily give you more project opportunities, but it gives you more credibility behind those project opportunities.
Yeah, I would agree that it hasn't necessarily won my firm more work, or maybe it has, I don't know, but I think it does give you kind of street cred, and because it shows that your peers have recognized you And so I did feel actually like many of the architecture firm owners that I compete with on a daily basis, nearly all were now fellows. And I was the last one to the game, to the party. And that spurred me on because I thought, Jesus, I've got to compete with these guys every day, you know, to win work, not just locally, but nationally and internationally. I got to get this F behind my name.
Right.
So that, you know, it spurred me on and encouraged me, and it made me think I gotta at least try. And so thankfully I was successful the first time and I didn't have to try again. But so I can't say that it brought any specific, it didn't, you know, change my life from one day to the next, but it does give you credibility, and I think it gives you, people give you a lot of respect,
Right.
just because they see that, and they at least the ones who know what it stands for and what it means, and in both your peers and the client community.
It was more of an emotional experience getting the fellowship at the ceremony than I ever expected, actually. That former AIA presidents sort of line up and shepherd you onto the stage, and one that I had been on a NAB board with sought me out, and so that was kind of sweet. In the academic community, however, I mean, we're really talking mostly about the professional community, but I remember when I got fellowship, the current dean at the time, who was a woman actually, didn't even announce it. It meant nothing to her, nothing.
What? That's crazy.
But then when she went up for fellowship 2 years later, didn't get it the first time.
Oh.
Then the second time that when she did get it, huge announcements.
That's funny. For me, it was very, yeah, I find it very much more emotional than I thought it was going to be. And I was tickled that my mother, my sister, and my 3 children came with me to watch me get this thing. And my family really don't know that much about what I do for a living. So I think it kind of blew them away, like, wow, look, there's mom. Must have done something right. So and none of them are architects. Although two of my 3 kids are engineers and one's a stand-up comedian.
Really cautious about, I was roundly scolded for saying that I only wanted to do this once. And honestly, there are some great people who slip through the cracks the very first time. Mm-hmm. And so I certainly would think that if you're interested in pursuing this, you wouldn't tell yourself, I'm only going to try once. You would say, I will try this until I can't try anymore, if it's that important to you. And honestly, I think it is important. And it does help you create this kind of platform for service that I think all 3 of us talked about a little bit. But I never said to myself, well, I did initially say, I only want to do this once. And I was like, slap that hand. Don't say that, because really good people miss out on the first time.
Yeah, really good point, Allison. I did only want to do it once, so I worked extra hard to make sure it was my best shot. But if I hadn't gotten it, I'm sure I would have gone back and tried again, because, you know, once you put that much effort into it the first time, you're not going to just let it slide. Exactly right. You have to go back more than once. Would be one that is worth the trouble, I think.
Yes.
But to keep trying. And like I said, I've got friends who did it 3, 4, and 5 times. I mean, God bless them. And they stayed in the game until they got it. And I think in some cases they did maybe change objectives, and because there's a lot of overlap between objectives, and it is hard to decide which one.
We have a question from Cece. Do you know what the juries, or do you know how the juries are selected, especially to make sure that there are diverse members selecting the FAIAs?
I honestly don't know, but I was on a national jury for design awards, and it was extremely diverse. So it wasn't for fellowship, but it was just for the National AIA Awards. And that jury had on it 12 people, no 2 alike. Some were old, some were young, there were men, there were women, there were folks who owned and ran tiny little firms, like a 3-man firm in Nebraska, and there were people who were principals and partners in very large New York City practices, and a woman from Florida. I mean, it was really, and a student. I was amazed at how diverse the group was. And I was also amazed at how they ran it. It was very interesting to watch that whole structure. Yeah, so I don't know how they do it for the fellowship. Do you guys know?
Yes. So they do select someone from each of the different sort of regions of AIA. Their members from each of those regions are pulled in. And when someone from your region comes up, you have to leave the room and sit out. You don't get to vote on that person. Everyone else votes on that person. And so there is geographical representation. Now the AIA's new initiative, well, I shouldn't say new, they're continuing an intense initiative for overall diversity is actually caused some of the fellowship juries and other honor and awards juries to change this year. They are really looking for more diversity and more representation from people of color, from women, from other minorities. And so it's absolutely being baked into all of the processes now. So I think more and more, you will see much more diversity in the jury, perhaps even in the question of fellowship than there is diversity among the fellows. And I think, that can only be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That said, it will always be fellows, I assume, that would be on it. We're trying to get more diversity on the accreditation board, yet inevitably, and in the accreditation teams that we send to schools, but because of the way NCARB is structured, they're, they all have to be appointees by a governor to a state board. And those folks are almost universally men. I mean, really almost universally men. I think maybe twice in the last decade, there's been a woman in the board, hardly any. And so they throw off the gender and the and the racial diversity thing pretty strenuously. So if any of you young women want to try to become a state board member, there's a lot of opportunity to shake things up in that world.
If anyone else has any more questions, you can feel free to post them in the chat or just ask them.
This has been such an amazing conversation, and we can't thank you guys enough. It's also just so inspiring to kind of see the depth of work that everyone has contributed to the field and how much it has influenced our region in general. Like Allison and Angela, you both have had such critical work being recognized for, post-Katrina recovery. And I think that is still continuing today, and we see the lasting effects of your work on this region, and it's going to keep continuing. So I find that super inspiring. And Judith, I know I'm biased, but having you as a professor has made a profound effect on me. So I just, one little shout out that each of you have done such an incredible job and brought so much to the region in your practice and also teaching as a mentor in general. And you have a very large effect on us and the emerging professionals coming up in this region.
Oh, thank you.
I would just love to do a shout out to you all, but also the Women in Architecture group at the New Orleans AIA. What an amazing group that's now been around for maybe 3 or 4 years, 5 years. Just the future in front of us. It's just terrific. And shout outs to everyone who's helped to make that such a robust community.
Yeah, kudos to the programming, whoever's doing the programming, ideas for this that are coming out of this committee. I think they've been phenomenal. I've participated in several in the last 3 years, and they've all been fabulous.
I love seeing you young women inspiring everybody else around you. It's really, you're having a great impact.
Hopefully we'll be able to do it with a glass of wine in our hands in the same room someday.
I can only hope so.
All right.
On that note, thanks everybody for attending the FAIA Women of the Gulf Coast this evening. And like Regina said, and echoing what she said, thank you all for the panelists for being here and for being inspiring and making us all, I'm truly inspired. Like it's pushing me with my career and what I want to do and who I want to be. So it's great to have you all as role models in this city and in this region.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Catherine. Thanks,
Thank
Regina.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
guys. Have a great night.
Night.
Bye.